design side of project development? Quite a few of you. How many of you have actually been involved in the design of pedestrian facilities, curb ramps, sidewalks, that sort of thing? A lot of you. What about construction? How many of you have built these things? Still a lot of hands going up. Doug? How many of you feel like you had everything you needed to do the job perfectly? Well, I think that's why we're here. I showed you a few of the online resources that we have, and also know that, you know, we're all resources up here. We don't necessarily have all the answers. Just ask Teresa, you know, we always get the difficult questions. Yep. But that's good. We'll try to help you work through to find the best solution possible. What I want to focus on for a little bit is what the expectations are for all of us. I'm going to focus on design and on inspection. What happens when you get assigned a project, what's expected of you. The biggest thing that would be expected of everybody is to understand what the scope of your project is. Teresa talked a little bit about alteration versus new construction, and that kind of surprised me too. But it's important to understand whether you're working on an alteration or whether it's new construction. In terms that we more typically deal with, reconstruction, rehabilitation, if that's the type of project you have, you're going to be upgrading your sidewalks, you're going to be upgrading your curb ramps, you're probably rebuilding everything. That's part of the scope of the project anyway. On the other hand, if you've got a preservation project, typically that only involves work on the pavement. You're likely going to need to upgrade your curb ramps, but there's some flexibility as to whether or not you need to upgrade the sidewalks. So it's important to be aware of the scope going into your project so that you know what the expectation is when it comes to ADA improvements. And the biggest tool for this is really referring back to that compliance policy that I showed you. There's a pretty good table that lists a lot of different scopes. It breaks down different types of preservation projects, different types of traffic projects, and what the expectation is for those. So become familiar with that. I'm going to start a little bit on the design side of things. First thing I like to suggest is get out and walk the project. Google Street View, Google Maps, Google Earth is great. There's been a lot of updates, even in 2019, and I rely on that a lot. But when it comes to ADA, you can't really get everything from that. You can't really get slopes. You can't really get widths. You really need to get out there and physically walk the project and see what's out there. And some things to look for: discontinuities in the system. If you've got sections of sidewalk maybe that are missing, maybe you can't get from one section to the other without going out in the road or across the parking lot or something, that's something that probably should be addressed. Take a look at your crosswalks. I mentioned that earlier. Crosswalks are not always located appropriately. Just because it's striped, just because it's been there a long time, doesn't mean it's a good thing. We often overlook sight distance. If you're a pedestrian and you're standing at a curb ramp, can you see traffic and can traffic see you? That's something that you definitely need to look for when you're out there. Do you even have curb ramps? In a lot of cases, curb ramps haven't even been built. You just have a vertical curb there. And so those are things that would obviously need to be addressed. A big thing is looking for obstructions. Look for anything that you think might make it difficult to get ADA compliance. Anything from buildings. By buildings, it could be the wall, or we'll hear later about a case study that involved a foundation that you couldn't see. Could be fire hydrants, retaining walls, trees, any number of things could make it difficult to upgrade a ramp. Another one that, if we'd been out there yesterday, we could see, if it's a dry day, you may not notice any drainage issues. You want to look for areas that you may be ponding in crosswalks or curb ramps. I mean, that's never a good thing anyway, but especially thinking about ADA compliance, you don't want to have standing water that people have to go through, especially when it could freeze and ice up. And then specifically typically for preservation projects, you really need to get out and look at each individual ramp. Preservation projects, you're not automatically reconstructing all the ramps, so you really need to know which ones are compliant and which ones aren't. If you're lucky enough to find one that is completely compliant, you can leave it alone. Otherwise, you're probably looking at some upgrades. And feel free to ask questions as we're going through. I tend to just move through the slides. If you have a question, just shoot your hand up. What information do you need in order to make good decisions? You need a survey especially for reconstruction rehabilitation projects. You probably have a survey to begin with. But you need to make sure that you have enough survey to completely look at your sidewalks and your curb ramps. So some areas that often get overlooked, we don't always have enough survey behind the sidewalks, especially the curb ramps. We don't always have enough survey behind the curb ramps. If you figure you've got to upgrade a curb ramp, you're probably going to be adjusting slopes and that sort of thing. You're probably going to have to do some slope work behind that ramp. You want to make sure that you've got enough survey to do that. If you're in an urban setting that involves buildings, especially if you've got sidewalks that go right up through the buildings, you want to make sure that you've got adequate survey, building faces, sill elevations, steps, doorways. You know, the urban projects that I've been involved in, the real challenge is getting sidewalk cross slope. And so you want to know the elevations of all those entrances and things that you're matching into. Another big one that we often overlook is, do you have enough survey down your side streets? When you put a crosswalk across a side street, you've got to have the 2% cross slope on that crosswalk. You need to get your curb ramps to meet all the criteria that you can, and that may involve adjusting the profile of the side road. If you have to adjust the profile of the side road, you're going to need a survey to do that. So when you're out there walking the project, take a look at that. If you already have survey, take a look at how much you have down your side roads and give some thought to whether or not you may need more. Yes?
Are you changing your approach on how you request your survey? When you're detailing ramps, you're typically talking about inches, and survey typically comes in feet. So the accuracy of your survey, are you requesting tighter contours or?
I believe when it comes to some of the downtown urban projects we have, I think as a general rule, we haven't, but we're talking about Hollowell and Waterville, those types of projects. We've gotten some LiDAR and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's definitely a factor. One thing I think I'll mention later on, we're not modeling, or we're not expected to model our curb ramps at this point, but yeah, if you think you're going to need some accurate survey, you might want to consider that when you're putting in your request. Yeah, and we know, so Teresa's going to talk about the various elements of a curb ramp, and we'll talk about tolerances and that sort of thing, and basically there are no tolerances, so yeah, we're talking less than inches, really. Field measurements, if you've got a preservation project, you may not even have survey. That's the other thing we're dealing with too, is on some of these preservation projects, we don't even normally get survey. On those, you need to make sure that you're checking each element of each ramp, and that may require, you may determine that that requires survey. It may be a matter of going out to pick up a few points. It may be a full-blown LiDAR request to get a detailed survey of a ramp or an area. Another big one is right-of-way. We don't often think about that because you can't physically see it when you're out there, but if you know you're going to have to make improvements, you want to make sure that you've got enough right-of-way to make those improvements, especially if you've got to do slope work in areas behind those ramps and sidewalks. Some decisions you might have to make, a couple new things, determining your width and your limits of your sidewalk. Something new going forward is, in keeping with what ProAg recommends at this point and will eventually require, and we're trying to adhere to COAG as much as we can in anticipation of that, they do not allow us to include the actual curb in the overall width of the sidewalk, or the usable width of the sidewalk. So, in the past, a 5-foot sidewalk for us included the curb. Going forward, that's not going to be the case. Now, if you've got a project that's already under construction or already in design, we're not necessarily going to go back and change all of our sidewalk widths. But going forward, if you're starting a new design, or if you've got a design that's very early on in the process, you want to consider that the 5-foot sidewalk does not include the width of the curb. So you could account for that a couple ways. If you know what type of curb you're using, you could use that to model your exact sidewalk width. Or typically if you go with a 5.5-foot sidewalk from the face of curb, that will account for it. But the key point here going forward is just be aware that we're looking for sidewalk widths to not include the curb. Are there any questions on that? Kind of a new thing. We're so set in our minds about the 5-foot sidewalk, and we're not. At least for me anyway, that's going to be an adjustment. It's important to consider that if you aren't able to get that 5 feet, you need to look at passing spaces at least every 200 feet in order to allow wheelchairs to get through. Now you can make use of driveways if your driveways are designed properly with a 2% section at the beginning. You can use that as a passing space. We talked a little bit about crosswalks already. Probably some of you have been involved in crosswalk discussions with towns and whatnot. They seem to generate a lot of discussion because people tend to want crosswalks everywhere. And we know that people tend to cross the street wherever they feel like sometimes. But you definitely need to refer to the guidelines that we have. And that typically will involve a discussion with the team, with your region engineer, your traffic engineer, and most often it's going to involve a discussion with the town to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And we want to consider things like speed and sight distance and distance apart. We want to have crosswalks where they're needed, but we want them to be safe, and we want them to be ADA compliant. Your type of curb ramp, Marcel's going to talk a little bit about that later. Perpendicular ramps, parallel curb ramps, there's a number of different configurations. We like to see curb ramps separated if we can, so that you've got curb ramps for each direction when you have a side road or an intersection. You'll want to refer to your standard details, the updated standard details that we have, and try to determine from that which situation seems to make the most sense in your case. And as we'll see a little bit later, sometimes you have to take those nice, pretty standard details and alter them to fit your situation. But we'll do the best we can with those. On a preservation project, we've already talked about how we need to get out there and look at each ramp. We're assuming at this point that you've done that, and you know that your ramps need to be updated or upgraded. Now you need to determine exactly how that's going to happen and what needs to be done. And as part of that, you need to consider, okay, so I'm not touching the sidewalk, I'm just rebuilding the ramps. But maybe in order to rebuild this ramp, I've got to reconstruct 15 or 20 feet of sidewalk on either side of it to make that match. You want to be thinking about that when you're considering how you're going to update your ramps. And then, like I mentioned, the slopes behind the ramps, how is that going to be impacted? If you've got maybe a steep grass slope immediately behind an existing ramp, and you go change the slopes on that ramp, now you're into the back slope, and you've got to figure out how you're going to accommodate that. Big question that we got earlier was, what's the expectation on what we're going to deliver? How are we going to get this information across? When we're in design, we want to make sure that we get this information out to those who are going to be building it. So we try to put a little bit of thought into that, into what would make the most sense. If you've got a project that has a full set of plans, it's a lot easier because your plan sheets are kind of your vehicle for conveying that information. As I mentioned earlier, we're not yet at the point where we are requiring each ramp to be fully modeled. I expect that will be coming at some point, but it's not practical at this point for every situation. But there are some things you want to make sure that you include. On your plan view, it's important that you show the limits of your ramp. We want to see the top of the ramp and the bottom of the ramp. We want to see where that is on the plans in each location. We want to see where the detectable warnings are going to be. It's not necessarily going to be a 100% accurate representation, but we want to see those represented on the plans. We want to see the terminal curb length, and there'll be a little bit more discussion on this later, but we're all used to 8-foot terminal curb sections. But if you've got a gutter grade that is much more than, say, 1 or 2%, that 8-foot terminal curb is not going to give you an ADA compliant ramp. So PROAG actually requires you to go longer than 8 feet, up to even 15 feet, in order to get your slopes. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And of course, you want to show your crosswalk locations. Construction notes, that's pretty standard. You need to list your detectable warning locations, and it's good to include dimensions. And again, your terminal curb length, that's especially important because those are going to vary. And here's an example. So this is just a basic set of plans with kind of a funky situation where you've got two side roads close together. We're showing, for each one of these curb ramps, we're showing the top of the ramp and the bottom of the ramp. And as part of that, we're showing the ramp length. So you can see right here, you've got an 8-foot ramp length, which is going to involve, that's 8 feet along the front face. So that's an 8-foot terminal. And then on the other side, in order to get a proper slope ramp, we had to go with a longer terminal curve in order to get that slope. Now, the question came up yesterday, what about this point in the middle? Is there any flexibility as far as curb reveal at that point in order to make these slopes work? And you'll see a little bit later in our standard details, there's some provisions for this point to be as little as a 3-inch reveal in order to get these slopes to work out properly. So if you didn't have enough space in between to get proper slope, with a full 7-inch reveal, you could actually reduce that in order to get your ramp slopes. So we're showing the detectable warnings, and we're showing the crosswalk locations. Are there any questions about what we're showing on this detail here?
Are you documenting the reveal requirements on like the curving and geometric plan for a case like that, or how are you?
Yes. Actually, that came up yesterday. We hadn't really thought about exactly how we would do that, but if you in fact know during your design that point has to be a lesser reveal in order to make it work, you'll want to note that on the plans. You want that in your construction notes. If you've got granite curb, you're probably going to have a geometric sheet, so you want to have it there. But yeah, absolutely. If that's another thing that you definitely want to show. If you're doing anything different with your curb reveal, you want to make sure that you convey that information. So you're giving both the length and the curve reveal.
CD1 would be challenging on that curve.
Yeah, don't put too much stock into that catch basin location. This is a great example. For another session, the first thing I caught too.
And it wasn't brought up this thing, so I didn't do it, just so you know, and I didn't tell him either.
We avoid when we can putting catch basins, as you know, next to terminal curves. This is not granite curb, so it's not quite so critical. I don't remember exactly why that's there, and I'm not even sure if this wasn't the final design. So, yeah, don't look at that.
Hey, Doug.
Yeah, Doug, don't do that. Anything else?
Yeah, Atlee, you mentioned a geometric sheet plans, but when we have the terminals in terms of construction notes on a rehab project, if we are going to include any radius, we need to specify the radius.
Yes.
The contractor needs that, so I'll just put that out there.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, if you do have a full-blown geometric sheet, you're gonna be providing all that information just like we always have. Typically, when you've got a side road like this, we do try to provide the radius of the side road, especially if it's a compound curve or whatever. This is an example of something a little bit more detailed. This is actually a Massachusetts example. It's not something that we've done here. And you're actually going to see this later with actual pictures of the actual location. Mark's going to be talking about this. But this is a situation where it was a pretty urban setting. It was a really complex situation where a lot of the points, there were a lot more points than normal. There were, well, you'll see the details later, but basically tables were provided that gave a number of points, a lot of points. It gave stations, offsets, exact elevations, coordinates, and I believe, you remember what this last column was?
Grade, I believe.
Okay. So like I said, you'll see some more on this later. And this isn't the expectation, obviously, for every single one of our projects. It's just kind of an example of what you might have to do if you've got an extremely urban situation, especially where you know that you need to provide additional information. So this is kind of what we see as the standard. And this would be kind of the extreme if you've got a specific situation where you know you need to provide more information. What if you don't have a set of plans? I think a lot of you have probably worked on projects where you did not have a set of plans. It's a little bit more difficult to convey design information when you don't have the plans. Obviously, with the construction notes that you do have, you're still going to be providing the same information. You just have to put warning locations. The terminal curb length that we talked about, that's important. If there is a radius involved, you need to convey that as well. But the new thing is that we're kind of in development. We're looking for a little bit of feedback today, but this is something that we've used. Actually, this was a Region 2 project. I've taken a little bit of license and modified a few things. Actually, Teresa did, and then I did, and so this isn't exactly original, but the concept is original to Region 2. Basically, it's where you take each individual intersection, each individual ramp, show the location, show a picture of the existing condition, and then provide some notes as to what your expectation is at that location. Now, there was, the last session we had, there was kind of some back and forth on how much information to provide here. We want to provide a balance between, in design, providing the information that we can so that it gets built the way we want it, without tying them too much in the field so that they can't or don't make adjustments to that. So that's something I think we kind of need to work through. But the concept here is to provide this sheet. It's not going to be a part of the book, but it would be a part of the contract documents on the website, just like, say, a geotechnical report. So we're providing information such as the type of ramp, referring to the standard details for which option was chosen. And some of this is entirely made up, Doug, so I didn't change your design. Talking about when you may need to extend curves, what you might want to do with your curve opening. You might even have a situation that's not at an intersection. This situation was basically taking a non-compliant mid-block ramp and eliminating it. So we're specifying here how much of that sidewalk needs to be rebuilt. So any feedback, any questions on this? I'm interested in what you have to say about it because we've gotten some positive feedback so far on this, so I'm kind of thinking we're heading in this direction.
I think it's necessary for a book job, to be honest. Yeah, just going by simple terminal curb locations, detectable warning locations, doesn't convey what you want to do. But I would add one more thing, perhaps, if you 'cause I like that setup, it gives you the information that you need. But I'm wondering if we should, like, take a PDF and sketch what we wanna do on that, and paste it on with a description. Just a thought. And if it doesn't need to be in color, then I would say just throw it in the book, but that's up to you guys.
I think there was some discussion about whether or not we wanted it to be a part of the book or not, right? I'm just looking for.
So I think yesterday, Kyle mentioned that by not having it part of the book, it's not part of, you don't have to hold it to the standard. It's just flexible.
Right. And I think that's why there was also the discussion about whether or not to include exact dimensions in these notes, because, you know, we might, especially if you don't actually have survey, maybe we don't want to give exact dimensions, because when you get out there in the field, those may need to be adjusted, and if it says here that we want a 5-foot whatever, and that doesn't work, well, now what? So I think we'll kind of feel that out going forward, but the intent here is to provide inspectors with something to go by, other than just give some standard details, make these all compliant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or it's not a location that's not been located yet, you know, flat along.
The curb ramp number on our inventory, we set that through our system, so you would put not present, and we would make it present. But, yeah, if you get the curb ramp number, that's really helpful. And again, just trying to go through the map viewer and getting those. I would send all the LCP curb ramp numbers last year for 18 and went through them all to see which were real and which, you know, what I thought were on some of them. But not don't do that on all of them. But it was helpful.
I mean, not that we want to standardize everything, but I think if we have a basic standard form, we'd probably even put it on the website so that people could access it. And then obviously, project specific, you may make some adjustments to it depending on your situation. But
Another question on that, Atlee. I see the first picture, and that's the overhead. The second picture, what is that showing? I mean, other than the detectable warning field, and this.
it's just a photo of the existing ramp, the close-up photo.
Okay,
Close-up
okay.
photo of the existing ramp.
So it's got the truncated domes, but it doesn't have the proper terminals and all that.
And the second one, the dome's not compliant, you know, you can kind of go through
Yeah,
it.
you can see this, I mean,
Doesn't say everything, but.
we weren't necessarily intending to list everything that's wrong with it. I mean, it's important, but not necessarily important to go here. What's more important is how we want it fixed, basically. I think the picture is sort of more to help you visually know that I'm in the right place, looking at the right ramp. I would actually think it might be beneficial on the overhead view to have some indication of, I mean, we're giving a written description, but if it could be labeled on the plan view, that might be helpful too, or the aerial view.
Or you could use some sketch tools and.
Yep.
Even Google Earth has
Yep,
tools.
absolutely.
Just to show aerially what you want to do. That would help tremendously.
That's the next version is gonna be wonderful.
Okay, Jay.
It's in the
Well, you guys started a good thing.
I mean, one of the reasons we started that though too was because we have a special provision that is a lump sum, okay, that we use on the preservation project. So what happens is, you know, we pay for the detectable warnings, we pay for HMA, but, if there happen to be another type of surface there, whether it's concrete or something else, it's incidental, and the curve is basically incidental to that. So we had to somehow say, okay, here's this special provision that we've got out there, and the idea is that the contractor, you know, follow our standard details and work with the inspector that's on the job, or the rest that's on the job, to make that as compliant as possible. So we had to have something for them to at least look at, point them in a direction. You know, some interesting roundabouts this year so far, but I think we're getting there. It's an educational process to get everybody educated, us as designers as well as contractors. Because every one of these are, especially on preservation projects, are very individual. You know, we've learned some things, you go out, and many of these, you want, especially if it's an overlay, you want to be paved by it first. Because if you don't pave by there and get that gutter line where it needs to be, you're either gonna have a high spot or a low spot at every one of them. So, there's a lot of tricks that we're learning now that make quite a difference to this, but if we go out and make several trips with contractors and try to get their, we're not directing them, but try to get their buy-in to understand what we're trying to do. And that can become challenging at times because when they go up and do it, they'll come back and say, well, you said, okay, well, we can get away from that. You're the one responsible for that ramp.
Any thought or objection to trying to at least get a rock terminal link in there based on what the existing grade is with some type of disclaimer?
Yeah.
Because we all know that it may vary a little bit, because we, you know, it's an overlay, if we should, then it may change a little bit, but we could at least give a general.
That's one of the things that Atlee kind of used.
Gutter line slope is.
That's what Atlee kind of do some, you know, made some changes here. I think Jay had on yours, we had some distances, right, Jay, on most of ours. And something
Yes, but
on
also remember, when we developed this original document, this is before we had the most recent standard detail.
I think if you can relate this back to the standard detail, like we're doing, it's a lot. You've got the chart in there now. It's in the website, myself will probably touch on it.
Well,
That-
it's good because it takes both the contractor and our inspection staff and I get one design.
I think if you have the ability to go item by item, and I think that's, we kind of left that up to each region at this point. If you don't have time or have the weather to get out there and see all these things, and you can't do the calculations, and you can't really go item by item. So it's kind of lump sum is available to you, but item by item is also available to you. So, and then obviously, if you're building it, item by item allows you to do change orders and just change the length and, you know, total number of terminal curb feet. You can change up and down the project if you have half a dozen of these or 10 or whatnot.
Yeah, that's one thing to note, we haven't talked about this today yet, but with the change to varying the terminal curb length, we're also gonna start paying for them by the linear foot. So we'll have a pay item for terminal curb, and it will be by the linear foot. I think that'll make it easier if you have to make adjustments in the field. Right now, they're by the each, and typically, it's assumed to be an 8-foot. Well, the pay item is an 8-foot, 4-foot or whatever.
Right, just like you said, if we have to go and use a terminal curve for
Right.
longer, you're not gonna.
Yeah, right, so, I think by the linear foot, we'll give some more flexibility there.
If you use long term items,
Scares me.
you gotta,
Yeah.
you gotta know what's happening with that one. Where you put that.
They locked right into it and did all of it. Right.
But,
Right.
and I think Jeff, on raised stuff, I think I'd be really careful about putting actual radius amounts. You want the contractor going out there making his own measurements to make sure he's good. I've been out for several of them, done it in the field. And what happens is you start putting it on here, they're not gonna look at it that way. They may auto up all the curve and it's second,
All right.
Radius is more.
Well, the other side of that coin too is, you know, if you get a subcontractor like Curb Solutions that does this stuff all the time, that's one thing. You get someone like I had in Paris, more in excavation, and good luck having them determine their own radii, so.
We had, I think
So
we
I
had
had
more in Richmond as well. I had to get out there.
So it's double-sided coin there.
Well, so this will evolve as we try to use it, I'm sure. So good input. I guess to wrap up the designer side of things, a couple things that you really need to make sure you do in the design, or as you go into the design phase, make sure that you identify as many of the issues as you possibly can, and offer as many solutions as you can. Understanding that you may not be able to come up with all of the solutions in design, some of that is gonna have to take place during construction, but provide as much of that as you can, And if you know during the design phase that something is not going to work, then you need to document it as technically infeasible, and Teresa's gonna talk later about how to do that. And then just communicate, share as much information as you possibly can with the folks who are gonna actually build this, so they can be best equipped to do it. And don't wait till the last minute to start thinking about how you're gonna accommodate ADA upgrades. And don't just assume they're gonna figure it out in the field. I'm probably guilty of using as directed by resident more than I should. And that has its place, but during the design phase, we need to put as much thought into it as we can to come up with the best solutions we can, and not leave it all up to construction. So what's expected of inspectors, field staff? Talk to the designers. Probably a lot of you were the designer. You cover both sides of things, but if not, make sure you talk to the designer to find out what their intent was. Make sure that you understand what level of effort they put into the design and where they're going with it. Make sure that you review the plans, review the book, make sure you understand the intent. And I'm talking specific to ADA right now, ADA compliance. Obviously, this applies to other aspects as well, but make sure that you understand your right-of-way limitations. If you've got limited right-of-way and you know that you can't go outside that, that may affect how you handle a certain situation. And just like we ask of the designers, get out there and walk the project. Get out there early to do that. Identify any red flags that you see. If you see drainage issues, if you see utility issues, or maybe retaining walls or things like that that you think are going to be a challenge, you want to identify those as early as you possibly can. That way you can kind of formulate a game plan for how you're going to address that problem. And use your resources. I showed you some online resources. Teresa did as well. And like I said, we're here to help. I don't like saying that, but yeah, we are here to help. Don't have all the answers, but we'll do what we can to steer you in the right direction. If you're assigned to a preservation project, if you're building a preservation project, make sure that you understand from design which ramps they intended to be upgraded and which they didn't. Hopefully, you'll have one of those handy sheets that we just talked about, and that will give you the information that you need to know. But you want to confirm with the designer that they actually went out and measured each curb ramp adequately to determine for sure which ones needed to be upgraded and which ones didn't. If they didn't, you may need to collect some more information, which I think I may talk about here, but if you don't have the information you need, you want to try to get that. Once you've walked the project and made a game plan, or if you've reviewed the sheet like we just talked about, you want to go out and lay those things out. Check that against the standard details. Check it against our design guidance. Good question in the back.
Yeah, on the preservation type projects, how do you, I think you kind of touched on it a little when we talked about maybe needing to get survey, but if we have a mill and overlay project where we assume we're going to match a gutter and wouldn't necessarily impact the crossing on a side road, for instance, but when we get out there and pave, we actually need to adjust the crosswalk, which then results in an impact to the side road crosswalk. How have you been accounting for that type of situation, or is that a case where you would try and get survey to know ahead of time whether or not that would likely be impacted during construction?
So if you're in the design phase,
Yeah.
and you know that you're going to impact a ramp,
You don't necessarily.
know.
Yeah, I guess the goal might be a mill and overlay, you're hoping to match the existing gutter and you don't plan on impacting those ramps. But say you get out there and you've got a travelway cross slope of 6% that you want to shim and flatten to be within the engineering construction range for a preservation project, you then might impact those crosswalks that you can anticipate.
Right, okay, so basically how you're accounting for that uncertainty.
Right.
I mean, that's a good question, because we're not automatically requesting a survey for everything at this point.
I don't know what survey is gonna do, quite honestly. I mean, you can survey it, but if you don't really know what your bottom line impact, that's why I was saying, that's why it's such a challenge on an overlay project, because you're gonna have either a water hole every time, or you're gonna have a hump, you're not really gonna get in the gutter line. So, I mean, you gotta pave through it, get that finished gutter line, what it's gonna be, and then you gotta go to the river. I mean, that's true, that's what's so hard about paving preservation. Right?
Yeah.
Because if you may think you know what that's going to be, what that gutter grade is gonna be, but ultimately, you never know until it's actually paved. Because you're not correct across the grade now, you're gonna have to change it. So maybe you'd have an existing survey, have it back there, but you may not be able to match.
Yeah, it's challenging, to know just how much information to get and when.
Another thing you mentioned was, for a preservation type project, we're not necessarily out there to reconstruct the sidewalk. But to get those ramps compliant, oftentimes, we've got to reconstruct some sidewalk around it to get a turning space or something like that. Is there any kind of rule of thumb that you've been, adhering to as to how far you take sidewalk reconstruction or?
You know, that's noted in our design details or standard details, but it's up to 15 feet. You don't have to go beyond 15 feet to change slope. But you do have to get it to the maximum extent feasible up to 15.
The 15 feet refers to the actual curb ramp.
Right.
Now, so if you're thinking about beyond that, how much sidewalk?
Right.
No,
I don't think we have any guidelines on that.
no, if you've got a ramp and you can't get the slope of the ramp, you can go back 15 feet down the sidewalk to try and make that.
Right, but let's say we go 15 feet, our ramp is 15 feet.
Yeah, you don't.
Now we've got to match into a sidewalk somehow.
Right.
We don't have any guidance on how much sidewalk beyond the ramp.
We just do it 15 feet beyond, at the ramp, out 15 feet, that's what we were doing.
Beyond or 15 feet.
Oh, beyond 15, yeah, you just have to kind of get it.
If the top of your ramp and the flat sidewalk was like that, how you can match that in?
That's why that's right, that's why they say up to
Additional
15. You get it to the best you can with 15, is what,
Additional 15? No.
no, the best you can with 15.
Catch it all with 15.
And if you can't get it beyond 15, then it's technically feasible, and, you've done all you can do.
Okay.
Clarification on that, Teresa. So let's just say you have your 2% cross slope on your 15-foot terminal, and you're required to have a 15-foot terminal because of your profile grade. You can transition from your 2 down here where it's good to 5, 6, whatever at the end of your.
Right. You really need to, yeah.
So at the top of your ramp, you could be at a 5 foot, or 5% cross slope?
No,
That's where the transition beyond the ramp comes in. You want your ramp to be up to 15 feet. At 2%
And that's gonna be all
cross
two.
slope. And then from there, if your existing sidewalk is,
but the existing sidewalk usually.
No, we're talking preservation,
Right.
not construction, where we're matching a sidewalk that is not.
so the
It's
existing,
going back 15 feet. From the terminal up 15 feet.
From the terminal up.
We know that
to the next.
we're saying,
So that.
we're building the 15 feet,
You
correct.
might not get it correct, you have to blend it up to the.
We just said it has to be 2% for the whole 15 feet.
Well, crossroads.
But
yeah,
we're
so
saying
what if the
across
existing
the
sidewalk?
Again, that's a technical feasibility. You need to get it the best you can up to 15 feet. You might not get it perfect.
We've
We
been
had
walking
some
it,
that
we've been
worked.
walking it in that 15 feet.
Yeah.
So it's okay to warp the ramp within that 15 feet?
Yeah, to get it, make it. And then when you get it down to the landing, it's more important to get people a place to land and turn. Because some of these sidewalks are not.
You're gonna have an area in there that's gonna be 2%.
So we go.
You chase that sidewalk forever.
Yeah, I think that also,
So the
yeah, it
15
also
max,
depends on how bad the sidewalk work is,
including
you know, if you're
terminal.
talking, if it's 5% cross slope, then obviously then maybe you're gonna have to warp it within, your ramp, but if it's 3% or something like that, maybe you can chunk out like an extra 5 feet, and maybe that makes a big difference, so I think it's just depending on how bad the existing cross slope or sidewalk is.
Yeah, I guess the short answer is, other than the 15-foot ramp, we don't have any additional guidance. So it'd be somewhat case by case.
And that's what we did in Waterville, we were blending it into that terminal. We were back 15 feet.
Yeah. If you got the real estate to do it, it makes sense.
Chasing the whole sidewalk.
Just go that extra 5 feet. Which just thinking in terms of, okay, you got the maximum restriction for whatever reason. You're good to warp your entire 15-foot terminal if you need to.
It wouldn't be, it'd be technically feasible to get it.
So at the top of the tip down, I could be at a 4% or 5% cross slope of the sidewalk, what you're saying, at 15 feet.
At 15 feet. I mean, the sidewalk isn't 2%, and it's not the scope of the work, it's the sidewalk. You have to blend it there.
It would make more sense, so, to carry that 2% all the way to the top, at least have our rims.
As much as you can, it makes sense.
Have our rims, correct.
That way, if the town, if a future project, you're not gonna do it again.
I would attempt to do that as much as we
As
can.
much as you can, yeah. I mean, you're always trying to get that 2% as much as you can.
The issue is, though, how high you take it. I mean, in most cases, since we've got the 15 feet now, we're kind of going with the 15 feet. Before it was, we may have had some that was a little longer. Jay, do you have any that were a little longer than 15? When we first took a look at that, those designs?
I couldn't hear you, so, yeah.
Did we have some that were longer than 15 feet in Waterville when we first looked at that design to catch the 2%?
Yes, but again, when we started looking at that, that was before we had that 15-foot guidance.
Right.
So we were just gonna chase it as much as possible at that point. You talking about the second or the third time we designed that?
If you have a specific location that you're questioning, let us take a look at it. We'll see if we can provide some better guidance. So if you've laid out your curb ramps, you want to check those against the standard details, check them against your design guidance. And as I said, you may need to make some adjustments in the field. We anticipate that as a typical thing. It could be as simple as changing the terminal curb length. It could be as complex as having to change a curb ramp location or moving a catch basin. Maybe the catch basin was put on the terminal and it shouldn't be. So you may need to make some adjustments in the field. If you get to a point where there's a situation where you just can't make it ADA compliant, this is where technical and feasibility is different from your standard design exceptions. So design exceptions for controlling criteria typically happen in design. Very rarely does that happen during construction. Technical and feasibility for ADA issues is kind of like a design exception, but because we don't always know that during design, we may not know that until construction. So if you're out there building them, and you're building something that you know can't be made compliant, then we need to document that. And Teresa's gonna tell us how to do that a little bit later. So just something to remember when you're out there as an inspector. Ultimately, as a designer, we're responsible for designing to the extent we can to ADA standards. Likewise, when you're out there building it, you're responsible for building them to standard. And if you can't, for documenting that it's technically infeasible. Take in as much information as you can from the designer. Communication, just like anything else, communication is key. And just like when you're designing, don't wait till the last minute to try to figure out how you're going to make all of these ramps compliant. And don't assume they figured it all out in the office, because there's a good chance that they didn't. And finally, just a couple of general expectations. One thing that has really helped me kind of understand how all this is supposed to work is just to think about how, say, someone in a wheelchair is actually going to maneuver through one of these ramps. How someone who can't see is actually going to be using them. Figuring out why all the different elements are important and how they're supposed to work together. I think once you get to that point, that will help you take the standard details and take our guidance and adjust it to fit a lot of crazy situations. Are there any more questions? Some good discussion, by the way.
At a signalized intersection, if we're impacting a crosswalk, is upgrade to ACEC considered part of the necessary
compliance
ADA compliance, yeah.
policy.
So we really want to update them. The, bill grant, they're all gonna be free.
Well, we're only a few minutes behind schedule, so we're doing awesome.